This is the
Five Stars
podcast.
Let me talk to you.
Hi.
So, what do you guys want to talk about? Tell me when I'm telling lies.
Thanks, guys. Back to you.
Boy, I'm just looking at my laundry list of notes here and seeing all the stuff I need to cover today. It's going to be a long one. I had a lot to say about the 1990 Great American Bash pay-per-view. And it's definitely a noteworthy show. So I'm not complaining about it. I was realizing, though, as I was jotting down notes and thinking of all the stuff I needed to cover in all those matches, I was like, God, this is a lot of note-taking. No wonder my arms were on fire by the end of the thing. I won't spend too much time with the opening monologue here. I want to make sure I give myself enough breathing room to cover what needs to be said for that pay-per-view recap. I'm hoping my voice holds up. I tend to get mentally drained when I talk for long stretches of time. That's why I break the review segments up into 2 different recording sessions. I'm not good at talking for 90 minutes straight without a break. So welcome to the Five Starr Wrestling Report. The wrestling podcast no one knows but everybody needs. You should subscribe, comment, and leave a like down below if you have not already. I might be taking a risk trying to record this later in the evening right after the 4th of July. Lord knows people are going to be trying to set off more fireworks. I think I'll be in good shape, though. It's not dark yet, so I have some daylight left. But, yeah, like I said, subscribe, comment, like, all that good stuff. We are here on YouTube and Rumble on Mondays and Fridays for classic wrestling coverage. We're back into the flow of the Friday podcast after a week's break. And I'm certainly looking forward to this one. The Great American Bash 1990. As well as Midsouth television, not to downplay the other half of the review. But the Bash is fresh on my mind. So, yeah, what do you say we dive into the fun? I was just flipping back through some old note documents I had typed up for the Saturday night syndicated shows. You realize it's been like a month since we recapped a regular Saturday night program? Last week we didn't do a podcast. The week before that, they didn't even air a Saturday night show. The week before that, I think, wasn't that the Clash in Charleston? Now, of course, we're about to do the Great American Bash recap, which I think I talked about this on the Monday show as well. I had completely forgotten about it. We haven't done a fucking WCW recap in almost a month. So I sat down this week and I was like, oh crap. That's right, I gotta talk about this pay-per-view. I blanked on doing Clash event reviews in the past. But the fact that I nearly left off the Great American Bash, that's a pretty big blunder on my part. But you know, at the same time, is it really that shocking? We talked about the lack of promotion when it came to the Great American Bash in 1990. Not just the actual pay-per-view, but the Bash Tour period. Come to think of it, I don't even know if they did a Bash Tour in 1990. They had already cut its nuts out the year prior when they started running all the slum towns and doing awful business, even in cities where they typically drew well for the company. 1990 was a totally different animal, though. And we all know pretty much what the entire selling point for the 1990 Bash was. It was Sting coming back to win the World Heavyweight title from Ric Flair. That was... I mean, I hate to say it. It was the only thing the show was significantly remembered for. The rest of the card was highly forgettable in most people's eyes, which is not entirely fault-worthy. Even with them going back to the roots of hosting it in Baltimore. I mean, Baltimore was seen as a safe haven for the company. They could usually rely on the market to sell out. It was an easy building to run. It was just big enough to hold a relatively well-sized audience without them having to tarp off or block out large sections of the building. So they picked the right venue. It was just... The fact that the Great American Bash didn't have any kind of leverage to sell tickets anymore. People weren't coming to see the show or buying the pay-per-view solely based off the name. It wasn't an appealing factor anymore. But we'll go ahead and jump into the card. You'll have to pardon some of the lack of historical background on a few of these matches. Again, we haven't done a TBS review in almost a month. We missed a lot of TV in the lead up to the show. The opener, for example, is Buddy Landel making his WCW return to take on Flying Brian. Or as Buddy's name graphic spelled, blank. A total WCW move to make. Putting up a graphic for somebody and then forgetting to put in the text for his name. So it's just a blank icon. Or maybe someone was just trying to rib Buddy. Oddly enough, I think I have an action figure somewhere with Brian wearing the exact same ring gear he wore here. The tiger print trunks with the white boots and knee pads. I don't think it was a WCW figure, though. I think it was a WWF figure. Which is also weird because Brian didn't wear short trunks when he wrestled in the WWF in '97. When I saw this as the opener, and Budrow's in there with the Flair gear and doing all the mannerisms, a lot of this started to come back to me. The story of Buddy's career is so insane. We've seen him pop up randomly in both the NWA and Midsouth reviews. I mean, this is like the third run he's had with WCW in the last 5 years alone. There was the one in '85 where he left shortly after Starrcade. Then he came back sometime in late '86 and lasted even less time than he did with his first run in Crockett. And now here he is back in the summer of '90, looking... Well, I'll put it this way. It wasn't 1984 Mid-South Buddy Landel when he was in the best ring shape of his career and heavily motivated. When he made his return here in 1990, he was very much out of shape and highly unmotivated. Hence his physical state. And kind of like a lot of Buddy's later career, I wouldn't really classify this particular run as anything remarkable. I think he's stuck around longer than any other previous run he had with the company. But by this point, he wasn't really being considered for anything beyond mid-card status. And I think he knew that going in, which is why we basically got Buddy here at 50% effort. And again, I like Buddy Landell. He was one of my favorite guys to watch during that 1984 run in Midsouth with Butch Reed. He had some great matches and some great segments on the weekly shows. But by now, I think we all kind of know his track record. To say he was unreliable would be giving him a little too much credit. He was basically here to do a job for Pillman. That's all there was to it. The match was meh. Pillman spent most of it selling, which meant that Buddy controlled the pace of a lot of the offense. Not the most exhilarating viewing experience. He started to slow down and get visibly tired the longer it went. Meanwhile, Pillman barely got out of first gear with anything he did. But he won with a crossbody attack. A match that probably went 5 minutes longer than it needed to. And that's being generous, considering the budrow we were getting at this point. And of course, things didn't get any better with the next match on the card. On live pay-per-view in the year 1990, they gifted us with the magnificent bout of Captain Mike Rotunda versus the Iron fucking Sheik. Did I mention in 1990? By now, I think I've done a thorough enough job explaining the backstory of Sheik's run with the company post-Crockett. You know, dating back the previous year when they signed him to a years-long contract and his matches were so bad they sent him home halfway through the contracted run. And he had been away for so long they forgot that they were paying him to sit at home. So they let his contract roll over. So, here we are a year later. And you will be surprised to hear his matches in 1990, they were no better than the ones he was having in 1989. In fact, they were conceivably worse. Poor Sheik, was blowed up less than 2 minutes into this thing. Looked like he was about to have a heart attack. The one thing I can't ever take away from him, he always knew how to generate heat from a crowd. Hey, let's be honest too. The only reason they did this match was because they wanted to bring out an anti-American heel figure so they could have an American talent beat him on pay-per-view just to get a cheap pop. I mean, I refuse to buy that they actually thought it was worth giving Sheik a featured pay-per-view spot otherwise. Not with his current conditioning. The match stunk, which we all knew it would. It really was like watching a carbon copy of the opener with Landell and Pillman, except Budrow could at least still go, even though he was in terrible ring shape. The Iron Sheik was both out of shape and physically incapable of doing virtually anything. So he spent most of the match beating on Mike and doing very minimal selling. Anytime Mike would take over and slam Sheik with a move, I thought Sheiky was going to break into a million pieces. He did give Mike some very convincing chest chops, where he just drove the palm of his hand into Mike's chest as hard as humanly possible. It sounded like a gun going off in the building. But Mike ended up getting the win with a backslide, which took about 10 seconds to set up and looked extremely painful for Sheik to even get into position to take the move. But that's all I really cared to say about that one. Yet another example of them taking stars from eras past and putting them out there 10 to 15 years past their prime, thinking they were going to get peak level performances out of them. I mean, I remember watching footage of Sheik beating Backlund for the WWF title in 1983 and thinking, man, he's looking rough. And that was still when Sheik had abs. I don't know what they were thinking having Sheik work a pay-per-view spot like this. A very bad call on their part. And then we had Dutch Mantell taking on Doug Furnas. One of the early highlights in this segment was Jim Ross trying to work around Bob Caudle's question of where Oil Trough, Texas was located. And it basically boiled down to JR saying, I don't know Texas geography well. Good cop-out answer. You know, it is a shame they really couldn't get the people into this thing, because on the surface, it was a very well-paced, old-school Southern-style match. But they really had a hard time hooking the crowd here. I don't think the Baltimore fans got it. They weren't really into the slower, heat-style driven match of Dutch pulling trunks and slapping around Furnas. You know, people actually tried to start a boring chant at one point. To which I asked, did you guys not see the Iron Sheik match 5 minutes prior? I mean, it sucks, but again, they were in Baltimore. It was the wrong kind of environment to do a style of match like this. And moreover, too, just kind of surveying the way these two have been featured on TV. I mean, how many matches has Dutch had in the NWA? Less than 5? He certainly hasn't been heavily featured as a heel on TV. Meanwhile, they've been trying to push Doug Furnas for months now. And while the guy had a great look and can do some really impressive looking shit, he was a black hole of charisma. The problem I had here is that I thought they gave this match way too much time. By the time they got to the last 2 or 3 minutes, Furnas was totally gassed. You could tell, especially before they even got to the finish, there were a lot of spots where they're just grabbing holds and trying to work through calling stuff on the fly. You can tell Dutch is having a hard time communicating things to Furnas because they're just fucking up stuff left and right. The finish was really awkward with Dutch doing a shoot off to Furnas. And after they do a little do-si-do exchange, you see Dutch just sort of waltz past Furnas before turning around and taking a really sloppy looking belly to belly for the 3 count. I mean, it really fell apart at the end. Prior to that, it wasn't horrible. It just didn't get over in the venue. People didn't care. I personally never got Dutch's run in the NWA. You know, I always thought, in addition to just being criminally misused, there was something about his style that never worked there. Part of the appeal with Dutch's gimmick in Memphis was that he was a lone wolf type persona who could be a babyface or heel interchangeably, you know, without directly having to establish himself one way or the other. And the people admired him for that. He was basically Steve Austin before that gimmick was ever created. In WCW, it wasn't the same type of presentation. He was always just a guy that existed. He rarely got promo time. His matches were always meaningless and there. I mean, his run in Smoky Mountain worked because Jim Cornette worked with Dutch in Memphis and understood how to best utilize him. But in the NWA, I don't think it ever worked. He was a small tadpole in an already oversaturated pond. There was no chance for him to stand out on his own. Too many obstacles getting in the way. Again, it's a shame. I like Dutch. He was always a fascinating character, and I love occasionally hearing his podcast clips where he's talking about the old days and sometimes surveying what's going on in wrestling today. He's a knowledgeable mind. But It is what it is. Speaking of Cornette, we mentioned Smoky Mountain a second ago. They gave him some promo time here to quickly plug the upcoming Midnight Southern Boys tag match for the US straps later on. I glossed over a Harley Race promo as well, but to be honest, there really wasn't anything special about it. And in fact, his match was up next. I just wanted to say, regarding the Cornette promo, you know, we've talked so much about the way the Midnights have been booked and featured since the Turner regime. All the ways they've actively tried to sabotage Bobby, Stan, and Jim, despite that they're still the current US heavyweight tag champions. Even when they know they're being booked like shit, even though they clearly have no reason to care at this point, like, you still got Cornette going out there and cutting great promos, trying to sell the people on how the Midnights are the best tag team in wrestling today. You know, I'm often reminded why it's always been a constant when it comes to the Midnight Express. The 1983 to 1990 version, when it was Cornette, Eaton, and Condrey, or Cornette, Eaton, and Lane. They've always been my all-time favorite tag team. And that's really never changed. Despite some of the great tag teams that were around during their hot run in the 80s. I mean, you're never going to hear most people in the mainstream say that they knew who Bobby Eaton, Dennis Condrey, or Stan Lane were. They might know Jim Cornette if you're lucky. Like, they weren't stars in the same way Hogan and Flair and Bruno were. Goddamn, those guys were such a joy to watch in the ring. You know, I'm still having a hard time wrapping my head around the idea that these guys are only around for another 3 or so months before Stan and Cornette walk out. And we're coming up on the end of an era. Truly. And on the topic of end of eras, it's a pretty accurate summation of Tommy Rich versus Harley Race in 1990. The Ole Anderson model of booking where he thinks he's booking Georgia Championship Wrestling in 1980. Not realizing it's a decade later and the draw of Harley versus Tommy on paper just isn't there anymore. And really, that was virtually all Caudle and Ross could talk about throughout the match. How these guys had a great rivalry in the past. 1981 to be exact. How the feud had such heat and had such drawing power in the past that Tommy Rich had dethroned Harley Race for the world title, and it's still a memorable moment in Georgia history. History that exists in the past. And while their physical conditioning here was considerably good, especially compared to guys like the Sheik, 1981 Georgia Championship Wrestling, this was not. This was a decade later when both guys had considerably slowed down. And not to mention, too, it was literally just a cold match with nothing at stake. Far as I know, wasn't this Harley's official first match back with the company? I don't recall him making any appearances on TV beforehand. Granted, we haven't reviewed the last several weeks of television, so maybe he did a promo or two. But I'm pretty sure his actual return happened at the pay-per-view. And with what we were getting at this point, I mean, he was still Harley Race, sure, but it was a far cry from anything he was capable of doing even 8 to 10 years prior to this. They barely even got out of the gate as far as I'm concerned. Like, they were just starting to pick things up a little bit toward the end, right before Harley countered a cross-body attack and pinned Rich from out of nowhere. It was a very flat ending. I don't know if maybe they got their time cut beforehand or if they were just simply told, you've got 6 minutes, make it count. But there was nothing special to it. My memory is that Harley didn't actually wrestle much longer before he had to retire from in-ring competition altogether. I think he ended up getting hurt at some point and then primarily took over as a manager and a mouthpiece. I mean, I remember him being in Luger's corner when he won the World Heavyweight title the following year. And I think they did some stuff with him managing Vader in '92. And of course, there's that really terrible car accident he got into in whatever year that was. In '94, '95. And that was pretty much it for Harley in terms of regular appearances in wrestling. Aside from indie dates or special appearances he did after the fact. But getting back to this real quick. You know, it's a match that you look at and think, I mean, they have history together dating back 10 or so years. It's Harley making a big return on a WCW event. Yet it was just a match. You know, slapped right in the middle of the card with little fanfare. Crowd was very lukewarm reception-wise. The work was okay at best. Another mild disappointment on the card. And like, I hate to have to say that about a Harley Race match, but it's the JYD principle all over again. He was a big name and a big draw in decades prior, but the reality hits you square in the face when you realize that drawing ability just doesn't exist by this point. It's a whole different class of wrestling fans watching. Like, even if a lot of the Baltimore crowd knew Harley or grew up watching him as a kid, the fact is they weren't going bananas to see him get back in the ring to wrestle again. The nostalgia just wasn't there. And they got fuck all or nothing time-wise to work with. It was kind of a waste. But then we finally hit a high point. The U.S. Heavyweight Tag Title Showdown between the Southern Boys and the Midnights. The game of who are the fucking baby faces and heels going in. You try to figure it out. Crowd reception didn't do a great job giving you any indication. Even with the pumped-in heat they try to use to drown out the Midnights getting cheered. I will say, it wasn't a Midnights dynamic dudes type situation where the fans just outright hated everything the dudes did. I mean, with Tracy and Steve, they were at least willing to let them do their shit and not heckle them throughout the entire match. But they still had a rough time getting the fans to rally behind the Southern Boys here. They were way too pro-Midnights in Baltimore. For obvious reasons. It was also another case of the Midnight Express stealing the show with having the best match on the card, despite them not being put in a position where that was intended to be the case. The Sting Flair main event is the sole thing this pay-per-view is renowned for, but the Midnight Southern Boys match is easily the best pure wrestling match on the 1990 Great American Bash. As was in most cases the story of every Midnight Express match throughout the entirety of 1990. But seriously, you don't believe me? Go watch the damn thing for yourself. Tell me it's not the single best match on the entire 11-match card. I mean, the whole thing is prototypical Midnight's formula for laying out tag matches, and it's always a winning recipe. You get Bobby and Stam bumping around and selling like crazy for the opposition for the first half of the match. It's the classic tale of the Midnights not being able to stay in control of the pace and constantly getting outmaneuvered. In all this madness, easily my favorite moment in the entire match. Actually, it was one of two moments. I'll talk about the other one in a minute. There's a spot where Stan tags in and wants to challenge Tracy to a karate kicking contest. Because, Tracy was in there earlier doing a bunch of savate kicks on Bobby and just lighting him up. So Stan's like, I'm going to challenge this fucker to a karate contest. I know karate. Surely I'll be able to handle myself against this amateur. And so he gets in there. He does some brief leg stretching. He gets in what I can best describe as a karate pose. And as Stan tries to throw a savate kick at Tracy, Tracy blocks it. He gives Stan a kick right to the chest, sends him flying ass over tea kettle out to the floor. Then Bobby immediately gets in there and eats a kick of his own. And meanwhile, Stan's selling it like, holy shit, this Tracy kid can throw a hell of a kick. Shit. And then that leads to the second greatest moment in the match, where as the Midnights are failing at every attempt to double team these two, the Southern boys are just firing back and knocking these guys off their feet. There's a great camera shot where Bobby and Stan get bumped out to the floor, and Cornette is so flabbergasted and so enraged that his boys are getting their asses kicked. He literally takes a flat back bump on the ring mat and starts throwing a temper tantrum right in front of the camera. And then he gets up and yells for Bobby to get their shit together because they're about to lose the belts. I mean, it's another example of what made these two an all-time great team. The fact that even in situations where they're getting utterly destroyed, you still admire the fact that they're in there fighting till the bitter end. And finally, they're able to cut off Tracy and work over his back for a while. I did take note of the referee discretion of Pee Wee blatantly ignoring Bobby and Stan coming in without tagging. There were at least 3 or 4 moments in the match where one of the Midnights would get knocked out to the floor, and then the other Midnight would just come in and start taking control of the match without making a tag. Definitely noticeable. But of course, the drama was seeing Tracy try to fight back and tagging Steve at the end for the comeback. And there was so much great action in the last minute or two with all 4 guys going at it. The Southern boys hitting their finish on Bobby, but Pee Wee was distracted trying to get Stan out of the ring. So you get a near fall out of that. And then immediately afterward, the Midnights ended up hitting the rocket launcher on Steve, but they end up getting a near fall because Pee Wee was dealing with Tracy. So they're really milking the back and forth at the finish, making it seem like the titles could change hands at any moment. And that, of course, led to Stan kneeing Tracy in the back so Bobby could hit a small package and get the actual pin on him. And they did actually have the fans mildly pissed off with the Southern boys getting fucked over at the end. So even with the crowd cheering the Midnights throughout the match like they were the baby faces, I mean, there were definitely a handful of Baltimore fans who were angry to see them win. Which is great heel work. But it speaks for itself. You have the Midnights yet again booked on a pay-per-view card where there's no intention of them being the focus of anything beyond mid-card status. And here they are yet again, coming out and having one of the best matches of 1990. What did Cornette call it? Another pesky match of the year candidate. Against a formidable team, yes, but let's also be honest. They weren't exactly presenting the Southern boys on the same level as a Rock and Roll Express or a Fantastics. I mean, Tracy and Steve are even lower on the totem pole than the Midnights were by this point. So that ought to tell you something. But this is still my favorite match on the Bash card, no question. And they would end up revisiting this feud shortly thereafter, although I don't recall any of the subsequent matches being as good as this one. If you're going to check out anything on the show, aside from seeing Sting win the title from Flair, man, you got to go out of your way to watch the Midnight Southern Boys match. An excellent, excellent tag team showcase on both teams' part. I can tell you what wasn't an excellent showcase. I was having to see the fabulous fake birds dressed up like Adrian Street. God, I forgot about this. When they wrestled on this card with makeup, glitter, and fucking lipstick. Dear God. I mean, I'll flash up an image real quick so you can all experience the scarring like I did. You know, at least when it came to Adrian, it was well established that he was a legitimate shooter who could kick your ass if he wanted to. I never bought for a minute that Hayes and or Garvin were believable ass kickers. So seeing him dressed up like that was suspect, to say the least. Anyway, I'm not going to belabor that horror show. Let's talk about Big Van Vader's debut. His first appearance with WCW. And ultimately his final appearance for basically the next 12 or so months, which I'll elaborate more on in a minute. They'd shown a few clips of him on the television shows. It was mainly footage of him in Japan wearing the giant mastodon head. Not really much in the way of highlighting his matches. I think it was more so them trying to get over the spectacle of Vader as a gimmick. Because, I mean, obviously, look at the fucking guy. He was most definitely a spectacle. And as far as him going out there and squashing Tom Zank in 2 minutes, surely weren't going to hear me complain about that. I mean, I was no Tom Zank fan, but they could have had any underneath guy go out there and get destroyed. The objective should have been the same regardless. You have Vader show up, kill somebody in a few minutes, establish himself as a monster force, and mission accomplished. Again, though, it was the fallout to me that was always questionable. It would make this particular debut situation so weird to me as a kid. Because I remember Vader showing up at this pay-per-view and getting the big win. And then immediately afterward, he disappeared from the company for nearly a full year before coming back. And because I wasn't following Japanese tapes at the time, I wasn't really fully aware that Vader still had date commitments overseas, which is why he'd been away for so long. I just remember thinking, God, this guy is really cool. Because I had never seen Vader prior to making his WCW debut. And then, well, he didn't come back full time for like a year and a half. And by the time he did come back, I was like, oh yeah, that Vader guy. I sort of remember him. I was still a big fan growing up. But my first initial memories of him date back to this really bizarre debut where he was there and then gone within a matter of weeks. Like, we won't actually see Vader in a major capacity being used until like spring of '92. When they have him show up and start pursuing the World Heavyweight title. I think he made a brief appearance in '91 when they booked that Chamber of Horrors match at Halloween Havoc. But he was still on a part-time basis even then. It was still a great effective showing. Just very poorly followed up on because it never led to anything in the short term. And then up next was the Steiner's Fake Birds match. or as I wrote down numerous times here, the suspect sissies, in reference to you-know-who, in their very feminine gear for this particular occasion. And I know some people might argue, isn't that where the heat's supposed to come from? Them dressing up like women and wearing all that makeup and shit? It would be if the birds were actually over his heels with me. I would quantify their heat as more of the go-away type heat. The I don't want to see you, please get off my TV type heat. It's kind of where we were at this point with Hayes and Garvin. And they started the thing with a jump start on the Steiners beforehand. Bearing in mind that the version of this event I'm watching is the network version they uploaded to YouTube, this was the only match on the entire card where there were very obvious jump cuts in the tape. Also, heavy amounts of audio editing to drown out what were obvious crowd chants of, we'll just call it, derogatory slander directed at the birds. And I have no idea what part of the video they edited, but it must have been pretty drastic for them to say, we can't air this on YouTube without getting the 3-hour event censored. So let's just cut that part out entirely. Must have been a ruthless crowd chant. Not that I'm defending it, but I mean, Hayes and Garvin looked absolutely ridiculous here. And Rick Steiner biting Hayes' ass at one point was a bit peculiar. Of course, up to that point, it was probably the most amount of ring action we had seen. There was a lot of old school stalling and crowd manipulation with Hayes and Garvin early on. It was sort of the same booking of what we saw in the Southern Boys Midnight's match, where Hayes and Garvin sold for a lot of the early stages. You know, giving the Steiners a lot. They got powered around and they would roll out to the floor and stall for a while. I liked here, of all things for them not to try and censor in this match, the Michael is a bitch chants from all the rowdy boys in the front row. Yeah, they let that one slip through the cracks. The birds end up cheap-shotting Rick and double-teaming him for a while. It was during the heat portion of the match where JR and Bob started acknowledging the feminine appearance of Hayes and Garvin, where JR noted, "I'm sure that look would get over in places like San Francisco." Indeed. And I can assure you that was not a good thing. If you see what most people look like in San Francisco, well, I hereby rest my case, Your Honor. And so Rick eventually fires back and hits Garvin with a bulldog to set up Scotty's hot tag. They end up taking out the birds with double Steiner lines. And then after Scotty hit Hayes with a Frankensteiner, Garvin tries to illegally hit Scott from behind to get a pinfall, but the ref didn't count him because Garvin wasn't the legal guy. Yeah, so now the referees are acknowledging who's legal and who's not. Imagine that. And that was a setup so Rick could get in there and give Hayes a belly-to-belly behind the ref's back. That way Scott could roll on top and get the actual pinfall. The turnabout is fair play finish. You know, all in all, beyond the absolutely repulsive, hideous image of Hayes and Garvin dressing up for this match, it's actually a fairly decent tag belt. It wasn't as good as Doom versus the Steiners from the Clash in June, but it was still fine. The Steiners were still massively over by this point. And we all know, too, they're eventually being groomed to win the U.S. tag belts from the Midnights in a little over a month. Which we all know Hurd couldn't wait to capitalize on that. He was frothing at the mouth to see Rick and Scott dethrone the Midnight Express. So them going over here made the most sense. I know the Freebirds experiment had rapidly started to run out of steam by this point. I don't think the gimmick is around for much longer, thankfully. And they sort of hit their peak with this Great American Bash appearance. I mean, I look back at this event and remember why I tried to wipe it from memory. Now I'll never be able to unsee it. Michael Hayes and Jimmy Garvin in makeup. Highly uncool. Something else I would have liked to unsee. It was a 6-man tag with Arn, Barry, and Sid taking on JYD, Orndorff, and El Gigante. Good God, this fucking match. This was... You know, it was almost like a fever dream. I can actively remember seeing this match on paper. Didn't remember a single fucking spot beyond the very limited stuff we saw from El Gigante. But the work from him was so ungodly horrible, it registered in my mind. This has to be the single worst match of the year 1990. Even worse than the Flair JYD title match in June. The irony, too, is because the guy practically stood on the apron and did nothing until the final minute, when he did get in there at the end, boy was it a doozy. And of course, this is also accounting for the fact that one of the other babyface partners in this match was the Junkyard Dog, who, as we've seen in the last month, wasn't really offering much of anything in the ring either. So you basically had poor Orndorff doing the bulk of the work for his team while the heels took turns rotating tags. I did love the group huddle spot where the Horsemen are on the floor conversing, talking strategy. Arn goes, "Guys, this El Gigante, he's huge. We gotta chop him down to size." Good plan, Arn. Really well thought out strategy there. I'm sure that game plan will go over swimmingly. Guys, he's really big. We need to take him off his feet. Then we'll have the advantage. I love idiot heel logic in pro wrestling. It's the best. The visual of El Gigante dwarfing everybody in the ring and making everybody else look like midgets, it really is almost incredible to think about. Like, the smallest guy in this match was probably Arn, and he was well over 6 feet himself. But you also got fucking Sid and Barry Windham in there, and they were both anywhere between 6'6" and 6'9". But they look like puny men when you compare them to El Gigante. Of course, we also can't neglect the biggest chant that broke out during the whole match. The chants of, "We want Sid." One of the members of the heel team. I know I'm just beating around the bush here, so may as well go ahead and talk about the finish. Somewhere during the melee at the end, Sid had dumped Orndorff over the top rope for the disqualification. Then the heels took turns trying to beat up JYD. And that was Gigante's cue to get in the ring to do whatever in the hell he was about to do. Here was everything I believe he attempted to do to the Horseman. And I use that term very loosely. He poorly shoved Sid out of the ring, which was Sid doing all the work and taking his own bump. He very nonchalantly shoved Arn out of the ring, which Arn barely sold. God, I don't even know what the hell he tried to do with Barry Windham. But Barry just rolled out of the ring before he got any on him. And that was El Gigante's contributions to the six-man tag. He had one job. He executed it about as poorly as one could. The fans booed the finish out of the building. And I wasn't so sure they weren't mainly booing El Gigante. Horrible. Absolutely appalling. To think that Vince McMahon took one look at that guy and said, "God damn it, pal. This guy's huge. We need to sign him and book him to wrestle The Undertaker at WrestleMania." The thought that that actually crossed his mind really goes to show just how clueless even genius promoters can be. It should have been a telltale sign from the moment he showed up at Capital Combat. This guy was not cut out for wrestling. They needed to scrap plans immediately and not even put the guy in the ring. Unfortunately, they did. And this was the end result. The fact that JYD was not the single worst worker involved in this match, that ought to tell you something. So that brought us to the three main championship matches for the show. I guess the US Heavyweight Tag Titles are of less importance. And, I actually ended up breaking this into two parts when I was watching the show over the weekend. Because I didn't end up watching the show until like 4 in the afternoon on Saturday. I decided, you know what, I'm just going to get through all the prelim and middle card matches, and I'll save the remaining main event matches for Sunday afternoon, when I'm less tired and more focused. It's a lot of stuff, man. So the first of the main card matches was the US Heavyweight title match between Lex Luger and Mean Mark. For some reason, it's still hard to wrap my head around the idea that Mark Calloway got a featured title match on a WCW event. Literally within weeks of him giving his notice and ultimately leaving the company to go work for Vince. And as far as I know, again, I don't know every solitary detail of what led to Taker's decision to leave. If it was his decision or if Ole kind of forced him out after the supposed meeting they had, where Ole told Mark that nobody would pay money to see him and he would never draw as a top guy. Meanwhile, how many months later, he debuts for the WWF, becomes the greatest gimmick of all time, and one of the more prosperous main eventers for Vince over the next 20 years. Good old Boomer Ole Anderson. Clueless and out of touch. Represented by all of his booking in 1990. Now, technically, I don't think Mark would have had the legal authority to have conversations with Vince while he was still under contract to Turner. Wouldn't that quantify as contract tampering? But then again, I've also read reports over the years that Mark had been negotiating with Vince months before his release. So it was one of those innocent phone conversations where they were talking business without directly talking business. A way to work around the legalities. Who knows? But hey, here we are. Mark Calaway getting a U.S. title shot against a top babyface in WCW. At the Great American Bash, no less. They talked about Luger getting a haircut earlier in the day before coming out here. I did notice his hair looked a lot shorter than I remember it being recently. He got another relatively decent sized trim right before Vince signed him in '92. Come to think of it, I think that was the shortest I think Luger ever had his hair. At least since '87 when he first came in. Still don't know if I approve of the pink trunks. Anyway, obviously this is a big showcase for Mark. You know, he had a few featured singles matches in the lead up to the show. He had that match with Pillman at the Clash in June. A couple TV singles matches with some moderately decent established names. But you know, in terms of like big featured main event attractions on pay-per-view, this was Mark's first real test. And you're going to hear people derive their own opinions of it. Whether or not Mark had a good showing here. Whether you would view this as Mark proving that he deserved to be pushed as a main eventer solely based on what he did here. It's one of those things where... Well, first of all, I don't think anybody ever actually thought Mark was beating Luger. It wouldn't have been a total shock if it happened, but highly unlikely. I don't think they were ever contemplating switching the belt. But there was a lot of pressure on him going in. And because Mark was still green by this stage of his career, you know, I don't think it's entirely fair to judge this match as a testament to whether or not he should have been considered a top guy at any point. You know, a lot of what they did here was very basic and very simple. Some might argue very boring at times, which I'm not going to fully dispute it. I'd be lying to you if I told you I wasn't fighting the urge to nod off a time or two. Unfortunately, I think Paulie had to work overtime to try to keep the crowd invested. There is something still humorous to me about the visual of Paul pretending to take a phone call at ringside while his client's getting his ass kicked in the ring. That happened like 2 or 3 times during this match. Can you imagine him doing that kind of shit in the WWF when he was managing Brock Lesnar? Like, picture Brock's in there getting beat up at the Big Show or something, and Paul's just casually out on the floor venting to one of his friends on the phone. About the other guy cheating, no less. They tried to do some creative stuff with Paul running distractions so Luger and Mark could fight on the floor for a bit. We got to see Mark do the old school rope walk spot, which he had already been doing in moderation, but I don't think we'd seen him do the full spot where he walks up the turnbuckle and halfway across the ropes before jumping off. As far as I know, I've really only seen him do like the partial climb and then leap off from a standing position. So he was definitely taking risks. I'm not trying to defend him because he's my all-time favorite wrestler. At the same time, I don't want to entirely shit on it just because it might not have been the most exciting match in the world. The closing minute or two was good when Luger had Mark up in the rack, and then after Taker had accidentally bumped Mark Atkins with his foot, they built to the dramatic near fall with Luger kicking out of a clothesline. Then Mark tried to set up Luger for the hard punch, but ended up getting booted in the face. And then Luger hit a lariat from out of nowhere and got the fastest 3 count of all time. A screw job finish in 1990, where the ref said, "We need to take this home now." So Luger hit the clothesline, got on top, and the ref went, 1, 2, 3, ring the bell. So Luger's reign continues as we're coming up on sort of the tail end of that long U.S. title reign he had. I'm still having a hard time recalling who he ended up dropping the belt to. For whatever reason, I want to think it was like Barry Windham or something. But I don't think that's right. Maybe it's because I'm thinking about next year's Bash pay-per-view and all the shit that went down with Luger and Flair right before Flair left and took the world title with him. Then the match ended up being Luger and Barry. We'll see. I talk about this so frequently, but there's so much weird, quirky shit that's about to happen over the next year or two. Which is definitely a fitting way to describe much of WCW's product. From like 1989 to 1992, early 93. Weird, quirky, and all over the fucking map. Then we had the Rock and Roll Express challenging Doom for the World Tag titles. Can I just say, I hate the WWE Network version of these old pay-per-views. It's like, yeah, they look great visually, but these fucking dubbed over theme entrances for all the top guys, it's so bad. I don't know what the hell they were using for Ron and Butch's entrance here, but I know for a fact it wasn't Doom's original theme. Not even close. So, naturally, after watching all those Doom Steiner Brothers matches for the past 8 or 9 months, seeing Ron and Butch working with Ricky and Robert was definitely an interesting change of pace. I did appreciate JR letting us know that despite guys like Ricky Morton being involved in this match, the smallest guy in the ring was still Pee Wee Anderson. $140 after a few soda waters. JR actually had some good one-liners on this thing. I think at one point he made fun of Teddy Long's mouth. Said it was so big he could whisper in both ears. It was good shit. This is kind of classic rock and roll booking. They're in there with bigger guys, so they let Doom dominate and control large portions of the match. Ricky and Robert both in there selling collectively. And they gave the Rock and Roll plenty of hope spots, though, to where it wasn't just a one-sided beatdown the entire time. Some good heat spots with Doom cheating behind Pee Wee's back. You had Teddy getting involved. Yeah, looking back, I wouldn't say there was anything wrong with the work here. Historically, I don't think people ever look back and consider the Doom Rock and Roll program a memorable or even classic great feud. And this is coming off the previous month when the Rock and Roll were rehashing beef with the Midnight Express. And again, Doom and the Steiners were tearing the house down in another great match. So this I would probably consider a bit of a downgrade. It was still good, but I don't think it had the same level of heat or drama that their previous rivalries did. And like the fact that Ricky and Robert sold for as long as they did here, I mean, I was expecting them to go with some kind of DQ finish to even give the Rock and Roll an outing. Have them get the win on paper, but don't actually have them win the belts. But no. They had Doom take like 90% of the match and go over by pinfall. Yes, there were shenanigans with Teddy. And Pee Wee Anderson getting distracted with Ron and Ricky in the other corner. But they had Robert grab Teddy so he could hurl him into the ring. Got a few clean shots in on him. And then Butch came off the top with a flying shoulder block and got the 3. I guess the payoff was the babyfaces getting their hands on Teddy. Even though it was very fleeting. You know, it was kind of like the U.S. title situation. Nobody really thought that Ricky and Robert were walking out with the belts here. When I was watching this, though, the thought occurred to me, aren't we coming up soon on Robert tearing his ACL and being out of action for like 6 months to a year? Like, the only reason I remember that is because they were originally planning to do the Midnight vs. Rock and Roll at Halloween Havoc in October, like right before Cornette and Lane left. But because Robert wasn't able to work, they put Tommy Rich in there with Ricky instead. And we got that interesting pairing. But I think it was during a live TV match, wasn't it? With Doom? I don't remember, but I know it's coming up within the next month or two. Another talent going down to an ACL injury. 1990 was a bad year for ACL tears. Is Sting in February in Corpus Christi, Robert Gibson in the fall. No good. Thankfully, Sting was fully healed from that ACL tear. And it's a good thing too, because he was the sole headline for this Bash pay-per-view in Baltimore. It all led to this. Even though historically they were planning for this title switch to happen much sooner. Because Lord knows Jim Herd wanted to get that fucking world title off Flair. Even if he had to pry it out of his cold, dead hands. And we're already running really long with the review here, so I'm not going to beat you over the head with all the historical perspective again. We know what happened in February this year. We know the original plan was for Sting to win the world title from Flair at Wrestle War, but because of Sting blowing out his ACL in the main event at the Clash in Corpus Christi, they had to rapidly shift gears and go with the out-of-nowhere Luger face turn, which in turn led to poor Luger getting fucked on multiple occasions yet again. His 87th failed attempt at becoming World Heavyweight Champion in WCW. I'm still amazed that Sting was able to get cleared as quickly as he did. ACL tears are very serious injuries. I mean, usually guys are out for way longer to recover from ACL tears, especially post-surgery. Sting was back in a little over 5 months. That's almost unbelievable. And they threw out all the bells and whistles for this thing. There was an arbitrary stipulation added at some point where Ole Anderson had to be handcuffed to El Gigante. Because that's the last fucking guy we needed to see out there. After that abortion of a performance he had in that 6-man tag. Let's have El Gigante make another cameo. It was good with the way Ole sold it. He's bad-mouthing Jim Herd and just being a total obnoxious prick about the whole thing. And then when he realizes he's about to get handcuffed to this giant 7-foot man, he's like, all right, dude, I don't have a problem with you. They also banned the other horsemen from ringside. Although the dudes with attitudes were totally permitted to be down there to allegedly prevent the horseman interference. They wanted a clean, wholesome fight. No bullshit, no interference, no tomfoolery. So it was a good thing they were out there. Sting and Flair. What do you say about Sting versus Flair? You know, at this stage, it's almost a parody of itself. It's a running meme in professional wrestling. We know the chemistry they had together. They could sleepwalk through a 5-star match if they wanted to. Hell, Flair could probably do the entire thing blindfolded and not break a sweat. And again, this is Sting's first match back since the ACL tear. He goes out there, he just works like the old Stinger. He's doing military presses, drop kicks, running at full speed. And yes, they worked the ACL as an injury angle throughout the match. It's not like they didn't draw attention to it. But you would never suspect that anything was wrong with the Stinger had they not used the ACL thing as a story throughout the match. Was it the best in the Flair Sting series? You know, counting the 10,000 other matches they've had since the first one at the '88 Clash in Greensboro, and the subsequent 10,000 matches they would have after the fact. I don't know, I probably wouldn't say that. Up until the last 3 or so minutes, it was a very paint-by-numbers professional wrestling match. You still had all the usual Sting Flair go-to spots. Those are always baked into the cake. Sting no-selling the chops, firing back when Flair's trying to muster up offense, the press slam off the top rope, Flair begging and trying to plead mercy when he's getting his ass handed to him. Like, all those usual tropes were still at play here. I think you can tell Sting was trying to be extra cautious with the bumps he was taking. Like, neither guy did anything absurdly over the top or dangerous here. The biggest bump Sting took in this thing was getting heaved out onto the rampway, and that was about the safest way he could land. Flair obviously knew the situation. You know, he knew the high stakes going into it. So if you want to say he played it safe here, I mean, you're not entirely wrong. It obviously escalated to where, after Sting had put Flair in the Scorpion Deathlock, after making his comeback and having Flair on the verge of submitting, that's when you had Arn, Barry, and Sid hit the ring to try to interfere, but they ended up getting stopped in the aisleway by all the babyfaces. There was a near fall where Flair tried to cheat by using the ropes with his feet, but then Scotty ran in and swiped Flair's foot off the ropes. By that point, you pretty much knew that Flair was fucked. You know, for me, and I don't know why I still have these recurring thoughts all these years later, even though I knew in the back of my mind, even seeing this for the first time, I knew subconsciously that Sting had to win the belt here. Unless they were complete morons, Sting was absolutely going over. But even so, especially after all the dusty finishes we've seen in the last several years, when you had the Horsemen out there doing the standoff with the dudes, and you got Flair and the Scorpion while the referee's kind of distracted looking on at what's happening outside the ring, there's still that instinctual part of my hindbrain where I'm thinking, man, someone's absolutely going to hit the ring and fuck over Sting. They're going to come through the crowd. It's going to be a whole melee. Now, I don't know who it would have been had they actually done something incredibly stupid like that. But there was a part of me that thought, if there was any opportunity for them to fuck Sting, this is the time to do it. When the ref's not paying attention, and all the focus is what's happening on the aisleway. But no. They actually made the smart move for a change. There was more back and forth to the end. Flair ends up trying to lock in the figure 4, but then Sting turns that into a small package. Flash roll up. 1, 2, 3. And it's one of those moments where you see them blast off all the pyro. Crowd is on their feet, showering him with cheers. Sting's in the ring celebrating with all the baby faces. It's a genuinely grand, big, exciting moment. Especially for Sting's career. Like, we're all supposed to view this as a big crowning achievement for him. And yet, man, there's always that part where you go back and look. Just the way with Sting and how he sold it. It's not to say that he wasn't happy or overjoyed. He just looked kind of apathetic about the whole thing. Almost like he knew the situation and realized, me winning the world title at this point really doesn't make much of a difference. And there's a line he cut in his post-match promo with Gordon Soley, and it still sticks with me to this day. I remember this quote all these years later, after he gets done putting over Flair and calling him the greatest world champion of all time. He goes, "Yes, I'm the world champion right now, and all I can do is give it my best." Which is very descriptive of how I think a lot of people perceive Sting's title reign in WCW. He gave it his best effort. They put the title on him. He had a title reign. It was considerably underwhelming. When they finally took the belt off of him at Starrcade later in the year and did that asinine black scorpion angle in the cage, which we'll cover more detail later on, it's a sad, lasting image on how the fans view Sting as a world champion or main eventer. Considering how big they popped when he won the title in Baltimore, I don't deny that people were genuinely happy for him. But I think the reality quickly set in afterward that there's kind of a reason Flair was champion as long as he was. Despite what Hurd may have thought of him. And I can't even really blame Sting for everything that happened during his first title reign. Or any of his subsequent title reigns for that matter. At this point in time, did it really matter who the World Heavyweight Champion was? Whether it was Sting, Flair, Luger, it would have been the same result. Nobody was drawing on the card for WCW in 1990. As much as people might want to blame the company for having Sting win the title here, that the timing wasn't right, people weren't clamoring for it, that Sting wasn't as over as he was prior to the ACL injury, a lot of that might be true. But again, did it really matter? You know, this is sort of a conversation that warrants its own podcast segment because there's so much to talk about there. It all circles back to the bottom line. And like I just talked about a second ago, the fact that, they could have put the world title on Harley Race at this point. It just was not going to make a difference. Let me just say this before we move on to the Mid-South review. When I look back at the show, even with all the historical context after the fact, even though we know where it all led to, the end result, Sting winning the world title at the Great American Bash, I still think was the right call. You had to give the people some kind of payoff for all that previous build that they left unattended since February. If they would have done to Sting what they did to Luger over the last 5 months, it would have been even more disastrous for his career. The problem historically is everything that came in the fallout. How poorly his title reign was managed. That's the issue. Him actually winning the belt, I don't think that was the problem. Yeah, don't forget too, there was a really infamously bad finish to the Sting-Sid Vicious match from Halloween Havoc, with Barry Windham showing up as the fake Sting and all that overbooked horror shit. That also didn't help. As was typically the case with all of WCW's problems around this time. It all comes back to the booking. It was dog shit. They needed a change of guard badly. They needed to get Ole the hell out of there and really start rethinking the business end of things again. Of course, this is what ultimately led to Dusty coming back in January next year. Even though I would still consider that a bandage to cover up a massive company wound. Yeah, we're now only starting to see just how bleak things were The fall of 1990. An absolutely disastrous period for this company. That's where we're headed. So we're back into the grind of Midsouth television. Even better, back to the gritty footage. Instead of the watered-down network version I had to watch a few weeks ago. So given that we missed last week, a couple little business items I want to talk about here at the beginning. We were told that Hacksaw Duggan refused to wrestle the other week, given that he wanted an added stipulation where if he defeated one of the members of Akbar's army, he would get Akbar in a singles match, or at least he would get him in the ring. And so that stipulation carried over this week. If Duggan was able to beat Kareem Muhammad on TV, he would get Akbar. Also, we were told that the Dutchman beat the Snowman to win the television title. Through nefarious means, of course. But when I heard that, I nearly jumped out of my chair with excitement. Thank God. They finally took the fucking TV medal off the Snowman. The part I loved is Joel's explaining how the situation occurred. He's talking about how the Nightmare came out and pile drove the Snowman on the concrete floor. And he suffered, and this is a direct quote from Joel, a brain concussion. As opposed to the other types of concussions that exist. No, we have to specify that it was a brain concussion. Wouldn't want to confuse the folks at home. Now, I don't know for sure whether they did that as a storyline angle to write the Snowman out of the picture for good. My understanding is that he ended up leaving to go to work in Memphis after he left Mid-South. But I don't think that happened right away. I think he'd been out of wrestling for nearly a full year before coming back. And I don't remember him working in Memphis as the Snowman. I forget what his gimmick was. He was a masked guy before. I forget what name they gave him, though. Point is, if he's officially gone for Mid-South, that is perfectly fine in my book. He wasn't doing anything for me anyway. His matches were the shits. He wasn't resonating with the crowd. It really is kind of an amazing run he had. He shows up. He's practically handed the fucking television title within 2 weeks. Since winning it, most of the time he never even came out with a TV medal in the first place. He had the thing going on with Dutch Mantell that never really took off. They just started to introduce something between him and the Nightmare in the last couple weeks. And, well, supposedly those matches are never going to happen. Or if they did, it was a one-and-done blow-off. Now, he might be back to work a handful of matches before he officially leaves, and maybe I'm just talking out of my ass right now. But I know for a fact the Snowman is not around Mid-South much longer. I think Watts had long since given up on that failed push. Right in time, I guess, for them to begin prepping for the return of Hacksaw Butch Reed. Funny how that timing works. And speaking of work, that was sort of the tagline for this VTR they aired of him training in the gym. Training and whatever you would call the other stuff happening here. Gyrating, dancing. The song they had playing was Hot Street's Bodywork, which is a relatively popular 80s fusion track. I would more so classify it as EDM. Maybe a hybrid of both. Whatever. It was a bunch of white teenage boys doing really awkward shucking and jiving while Butch was powerlifting. And I seem to vaguely recall them airing this same video back in like 1984, like right after Butch turned babyface on Buddy Landell, and they did the whole television angle with him refusing to join the Akbar army. Of course, that was right around the same time he and Duggan were feuding as well. So there was a lot of unresolved tension going on there. But yeah, I've definitely seen this video before. Or maybe it was something I remember when I went back and watched a lot of the Midsouth library years ago, because it was such an awkward, memorable video. But that'll be something to look forward to in the coming weeks. The return of Hacksaw Butch Reed. And then we had the official TV opener of Dutch Mantell versus Terry Taylor. Wrote here, all of a sudden I'm in a time machine watching Memphis wrestling from 1982. I've actually been watching a lot of old Memphis footage recently on YouTube. I've been kind of binge watching the 1984 tape library. Gotta say, as much as I love Memphis wrestling from like late 81 to 83, what is typically considered the glory years of the promotion, 1984 is damn good, man. Some of that time period is severely underrated. The Rick Rude, Jerry Lawler feud. Randy Savage is a heel. God, Savage was such a great bad guy. All the Poffomania shit. Austin Idol. A young Eddie Gilbert coming into the fold. The stuff with him and Tommy Rich. I mean, there's a lot of great history in 1984 Memphis that unfortunately often gets neglected. Just because of where things were historically at that point and how popular the WWF was starting to grow because of the national expansion. Not to mention Mid-South and all the amazing stuff that they were doing down there at the time, which obviously we already covered. Anyway, I'm getting very easily sidetracked this week. Geeking out too much over wrestling history. So, Dutch versus Taylor. It's a TV title match. It's still hilarious to me that even in non-HD, you can still clearly see all of Dutch's body hair. Try to imagine being the guy having to work with that. It's a great little formula they had going on here, though. With Dutch doing the cat and mouse chase early on, trying to play keep away from Taylor because Taylor kept the offensive pressure going. And as they start building to the payoff at the end, you got Dutch and Taylor exchanging a couple quick near falls. Some really good back and forth at the end. Crowd was really into it. And right as Taylor goes to kick Dutch into the corner to break up a pin, you see Dutch going to grab the bullwhip as Taylor goes over to try to pry him out of the corner. And as Taylor shoves Pee Wee Anderson out of the way, Dutch turns around and suckers Taylor in the throat with a cowbell to steal the pinfall. It was a good heat finish. The work I thought was fun. They did kind of sell it like it was a considerably big upset, which I found kind of strange. I mean, for one, he cheated. And while, yes, he beat Terry Taylor, I mean, it's not like Dutch Mantell was a ham and egger that never established himself as a star. Maybe in Mid-South, the people didn't see him on the same level as people did in Memphis. But still, it's the fucking Dutchman. But we'll see how they develop this. I mean, remember, given some of the details of his run, Dutch has done a couple interviews being openly critical about his Mid-South run in '85. So maybe that whole television title reign wasn't anything to write home about. Or maybe it was Dutch being Dutch. The bitter, disgruntled ring veteran. Who knows? So that took us to Hacksaw Duggan versus Kareem Muhammad, aka the Zambui Express, which they're still calling him in these singular tense. even though the Zambui Express traditionally was affiliated with the tag team when it was Ray Candy and Leroy Brown. We had some pre-taped comments from Duggan beforehand, talking about the whole situation with Akbar and how things have boiled over to where we're at now. Got to admit, too, this was a fucking hella great promo. You had Duggan talking about how he's sick of all these terrorists coming in and trying to make a name at the expense of the American value just because they have a thick pocket. Goes over the stipulation that if he beats the Zambui Express today, he gets Akbar in the ring. And after everything Akbar has done to Duggan, not exclusively talking about when he shot the fireball in his eye, all the pain, all the heartbreak, it all comes to an end today on television. Because Duggan is going to finish what Akbar tried to start months ago. And of course, Akbar got to rebut in a pre-taped comment of his own, essentially calling Americans soft and saying the reason the Kamalas and the Zambui Expresses of the world are making such headway in wrestling is because they're bigger threats than any of these so-called wrestlers in America. All Akbar has to do is write a check and he can unleash hell on anybody in Mid-South. You know, I heard this promo and it's funny how this type of angle or story arc in wrestling often gets overlooked these days, especially since the death of the territories, when this was sort of the go-to when it came to getting over monster heels, especially foreigners. You know, you have a heel manager bring in some big, mean, ugly-looking guy. The idea usually being that the manager paid off or signed the monster to do his dirty bidding for him. You have him kill everybody on the roster until he finally meets the top babyface, and that's where the money is typically drawn. You know, you think every territory implemented this style of booking in one form or another. You think about today's era, you never see this kind of shit anymore. I mean, monster heels don't even exist as a term in wrestling anymore. Nobody's a monster. Everybody's fucking 5'6" and weighs as much as the kids stacking shelves at Walmart. It's such a lost art in today's business. So the Duggan Kareem match, I will say this. It wasn't pretty. As I alluded to during our retro WWF review on Monday, Hacksaw Duggan had many great attributes as a talent. Ring work, probably not among the top ones. And I don't know how many of you know Ray Candy or have seen any footage of him out there, or if you can even envision what he looks like. Do a quick Google search for reference. I mean, there's plenty of pictures of him out there. Let's just say he was quite rotund. So, bearing in mind, picture a very round, unathletic, 350-pound man working with Hacksaw Duggan. It was not like watching Terry Taylor work with Dutch Mantell in the open. Ray would do these diving headbutt spots, and to even call them diving headbutts, it's being way too generous. He essentially would hit the ropes and just fall over like a tree stump. Sometimes his head would make contact with the other guy. If he did manage to get himself up in the air, it was like half an inch off the ring mat. Mabel had more stamina than this fucking guy did. So the match is more or less horrendous, but the people are eating it up because, Duggan's in it. Shocking to say, Duggan was very much over in Mid-South. They eventually get to the spot where Duggan gives Kareem the running football tackle and sends him barreling out of the ring. And that set up the deal where he yanks Akbar into the ring and starts unloading on him. Eventually, Kareem gets back in to continue the fight with Duggan. And then eventually Kamala runs out for the DQ. And this next part, you know, it's one of those moments where you watch as a fan, especially an older fan, and you're like, man, how in the fuck did anybody watch this and ever think wrestling was real? Okay, so they got Duggan pinned down so Akbar can stomp on him. These foot stomps, dear God, I like Skandar Akbar, but holy shit. These foot stomps would not have been enough to break an egg. He's just whiffing Duggan with the fakest looking stomps I've ever seen. I'm watching it thinking, like, they understand people can blatantly tell he's barely making contact with Duggan's sternum, right? If I were Watts, I would have fined him. I'd have been like, you're not getting paid this week, dude. You owe me money for exposing the business. That's how horrible this looked. And so you get all the underneath geeks running out to try to save Hacksaw, but they all get shit-canned immediately. That is until they send out, and I actually wrote all these names down here because there's a payoff to this bit here, Terry Taylor, Brickhouse Brown, Mark Reagan, The Fantastics, Al Perez, and I wrote this down as an exact quote, Al Perez, fuck. There's a name I haven't thought about in this retro series in a hot minute. I was happy we tapped out of the World Class series before we ever got a chance to talk about Al Perez, boring the brakes off of everybody in Dallas. For those of you that don't know, go listen to my NWA reviews from 1988. That'll give you plenty of insight on what I thought about Al Perez. The guy that made Johnny Gargano look like he had more than one facial expression. It was just so passive too. They're like, hey look, Al Perez is in there. Oh. Indeed he is. So he's in Midsouth now. Great. I mean, unless he debuted the other week, this is technically our first look at Al Perez in Midsouth. And he's about to have a fairly lengthy run there as well. But they just talked it up like, yep, that's Al Perez. And don't worry, we'll have plenty more to say about Al Perez. He actually wrestled on the show here. But, now we'll get to it. And then we had the greatest segment of all time. The greatest segment since, well, the last great segment that these two teams had together on TV. So it's scheduled to be Ted DiBiase and Dr. Death versus Terry Daniels and Frankie Lane. But Jake Roberts and the Barbarian decided to crash the party again and get in the champs' faces to issue another challenge. Now you might recall a TV angle from some odd weeks ago. There was a confrontation between these exact two teams where they both got into a fight. And then, well, nothing happened. They had seemingly forgotten about the program altogether. There was no follow-up. There was no mention of it. They had not crossed paths since that point. Like, I was beginning to think, well, they must have dropped the story, because I don't have any memory of these two teams actually having a match in Mid-South. Well, it appears it's being revisited. So you got Jake getting in Ted's face and demanding one match. He and the Barbarian want one singular title shot to prove that they're the best team in Mid-South. And of course, DiBiase is doing the typical roundabout thing where he's talking about how they have a signed contract to wrestle these two job guys, and since they don't have any legal authority to switch matches on the fly, well, Roberts and Barbarian can eat shit and like it. And that leads to this amazing moment where Roberts goes, oh, God, hold on a second here. So you're telling us the only reason you guys can't defend the tag belts this week is because of these two jabronis standing here? Ted goes, yeah, that's right. And so, well, like complete and utter schmucks that they were, Jake and the Barbarian casually walk over to Terry Daniels and Frankie Lane. They immediately dispose of them and leave them for dead. And then Jake just calmly goes back and goes, hey, look at that. You have no challengers now. And here's what makes all of it so incredibly fascinating, as well as funny. You have two heel teams facing off here. The one heel team went over and beat the holy hell out of these underneath guys, like complete and total dicks. And the crowd cheered for it. They were so happy that the heels came in and spared them from having to watch another boring squash match. They're like, give us the match with the star power. We don't care that it's heel versus heel. We just want to see guys rip into each other and bloody themselves up. Irony at its finest. And there's more. You get DiBiase calling in Grizzly Smith to put these two idiots in their place, as them try to rationalize the situation and explain how they can't be bullied into defending their Mid-South tag titles like that. To which Grizzly goes, well, typically I would agree that matches can't be coerced when we're dealing with normal people. But when I look around me, and again, this is almost a direct quote, when I look around me, I don't feel I'm dealing with normal people. That line, I laughed at that line. That was a genuinely funny moment that had no reason to be as comical as it was. I think it was because it was Grizzly Smith, and he always had such a dry delivery. But it was so true. I looked around and said, you know, Grizzly's got a damn good point. These men are not normal people. Especially not Jake or the Barbarian. And so he attempts to sign off on an impromptu title match. But then DiBiase and Dr. Death look around and go, no, fuck this. And they immediately bail and tell Grizzly to take it up with their lawyers. God, this segment was so awesome. And again, what makes it all great is they're not directly pinning up a babyface and a heel team. They're both heels. Nobody's really teasing any kind of turn. But they're still hooking the people into wanting to see the showdown, because the whole selling point of it is what happens when these two behemoth teams clash. You really don't know which way it's going to go. Now, I don't know why they waited so long in between the first initial confrontation to go back to the well with it, but it never lost any steam. It's still a hot program. Everybody in this segment was outstanding. Can't put it over enough. They could do like 5 more segments like this on TV and it would be equally as great every time. Then we had the Nightmare versus Wendell Cooley. Oh, I'm sorry. I keep calling him by his old gimmick name. He's now the champion because he holds the North American title. Yeah, I actually don't have a ton to say about this one. It was the champion methodically working over Coley's arm for several minutes and then going over with a pile driver. There was a spot right before the pile driver where Coley tried and failed twice to do something off the middle turnbuckle, but he slipped both times and nearly ate shit. I'm trying to think about it. I don't remember seeing a whole lot of Wendell Coley footage. I remember him not being very good. Was he better than Al Perez? No, actually the thing is, Al Perez was not a bad wrestler. He was just boring and milquetoast as fuck to watch in the ring. Wendell Coley was just a bad professional wrestler. Yeah, maybe not even bad. Just below average. Like, what was his face? Who had the gimmick in WCW? Was it Mike Sanders? No, but he was above average Mike Sanders, which was even funnier. Wendell was just below average. And that's even worse. On the topic of things I would consider below average, this Brickhouse Brown Mark Reagan versus Red Raider Paul Brown match. It was very much that. One of the very first spots Reagan tried in this match was a cartwheel into a hammerlock hold. He fell right on his ass. I also laughed at the spot where they tried to shoot off Brown so Reagan could give him a lariat. They mistimed the spot so badly. When Brown went to jump over Brickhouse, who did the drop-down spot, Reagan was so out of position for the clothesline, he actually had to back up in order to give Reagan enough room to charge at him. It was the wildest shit I've ever seen. Paul Brown literally had to moonwalk backwards as he was running toward another man to take a move. Never seen anything like it. Even JR was like, yeah, they didn't nail that spot like they wanted to. That's when you know things have gone horribly wrong. When Jim Ross, the babyface straight shooter commentator, is openly saying, yeah, these guys fucked up. They eventually put Brown away with a leapfrog dropkick spot. That looked okay. You know, I kind of forgot just how truly horrible this match was. I'm looking at some of my other notes here. There was another weird-looking exchange with Brickhouse and the Raider that looked kind of sloppy and mistimed. I have no idea what the hell happened in this match, but the chemistry wasn't there. These guys were just sleepwalking through spots. Even the crowd got a little restless by the end of it. Not good. Not good at all. And then we got Al Perez versus Pat Rose. I know I kind of built up the anticipation, but before I talk about what went down here, let me try to be objective for a second. Here were Al Perez's strengths as a worker. He had a great body, and like I talked about earlier, he was a moderately decent to good worker. Air quotes around good. Meaning that he was competent and could have a match if he wanted to. I forget what he did prior to coming to Midsouth, but I know Midsouth was considered his first big breakthrough of gaining national exposure. Then he went to World Class in '87, and that's when they started billing him as the American heartthrob, put him with Gary Hart, and did the feud with him and the Von Erichs, which was a relatively successful program for whatever World Class was in 1987. A shell of the company it was in 1982 to 1984, that's for sure. I mean, he was another one of those pinball bouncers, as I like to coin. He never really stayed in one particular area for long stretches of time. He was in Midsouth for a couple years, and then he went to Dallas for a little over a year. Then he went to Crockett for about 6 months before fading into oblivion. There was the very forgettable WWF run that never really went anywhere. I think he went back to WCW sometime in the early 90s. And I know he did some stuff on and off in Puerto Rico at various stages as well. It was just a lot of constant shifting back and forth, back and forth. And I've heard the rumor dispelled about him getting sideways with Ric Flair at one point because for whatever reason he thought Flair should have dropped the world title to him in WCW. I don't know how much of that story is true, but I mean, the guy was a bit of a nutcase to begin with. So nothing surprises me. Again, though, when you look at him as an overall package, I didn't get it. I still don't get it to this day. His matches are just nothing burgers, man. Complete nothing burgers. Now, in all fairness, I can't critique that situation here because the match went literally 30 seconds. It was Rose trying to fake out Perez with a handshake at the beginning, but then Perez caught an attempted boot. Then he spun around and gave Rose a bridging suplex for the pin. So he did not have enough time to bore me into a coma with his offense. Although that'll quickly change given time. They're trying to bill him with the lightning fast persona. That he's a fast-moving athlete who can hit you out of nowhere with his finish. How much of that was a cognizant move on their part so we didn't have to watch him work long in the ring? I don't know. It was painless enough for 1 week. Probably the best Al Perez match you'll ever see. Short and sweet to the point. I wish they were all like that. And that left us with a Fantastics video package to close things out. We also had JR and Joel recapping the program and hyping up a few big things for next week. I think they plugged the return of Butch Reed and Dick Murdoch. Beyond that, though, looking back at the show, minus my thoughts on Al Perez and that absolutely atrocious Brickhouse Brown Mark Reagan tag match, the rest of the show I thought was pretty damn great. Loved the TV title opener. The angle with Duggan and Akbar accomplished what it needed to in order to further that story along. Akbar's shitty kicks notwithstanding. The angle with DiBiase, Williams, Roberts, and the Barbarian, that was all done well. It's definitely becoming more apparent, though, that the future talent pool doesn't look as strong. You know, you have to keep in mind that we are on the slow downturn of the territories. Top names are starting to get offered contracts to go work for the two big promotions. Obviously, I'm talking about WWF or Crockett. And you're starting to see the struggle of Watts looking for new, fresh names to bring in. In a lot of ways, I think I talked about this the other week during the Mid-South review. That was part of the problem when he ransacked most of the Dallas roster in 86 and 87. It wasn't so much the problem of him bringing in already established names from another territory. It was names that the people had already been accustomed to, like guys who the Mid-South fans were at least relatively aware of. You know, there wasn't that hot, young, fresh star that was working his way through the ranks and, well, becoming a future household name. Like, you think about the other regions, Florida, Memphis, Minneapolis, Georgia. name the territory. How many of those guys were left out there? Vince was gobbling up names left and right. Crockett was trying to get his hands on the guys who Vince didn't want. The ones who were going to be big stars down the future. It really kind of left Watson in a no-win situation. Especially by the time the UWF rebrand happened. Now it was him just trying to ride the wave of momentum of past successes like the Freebirds or going back to the well with the Dallas Stars. And as much as I like DiBiase and Duggan and everything those guys did for the Mid-South area during their prime runs, by 86, 87, they weren't necessarily fresh either. Agbar, same thing. The Devastation Inc. stuff had long since run its course. There were just not a whole lot of new or innovative ideas out there. The one money guy he had was Sting. But we all knew it was only a matter of time before he would have gotten offered a contract to go work for Crockett. Yeah, a lot of moving parts in all this. But we're starting to see the cracks develop. Even though things don't seem all that bad right now. Which is typically a sign that we know things are on the downturn. You don't notice the cracks right away because they're so trivial and small. But they're only going to grow in size as the months progress and we start to see the business side of things collapse. You want an example of that? Crockett Promotions, 1988. Things seem so fine in the summertime, but boy howdy, behind the scenes, it was a hot mess. More stuff we've already covered, though. Anyway, this is a long-ass podcast this week. I think this might be the longest show we've done in a very long time. This one actually might surpass the 2-hour mark. Hopefully y'all stuck through it, though. But I'm going to get out of here and probably start the editing process a day early just so I can try to get it uploaded in time. And I'm not killing myself on Thursday. But thanks everybody for watching, and I will talk to you all on Monday. The return to form, Retro Raw. Good Lord in heaven. What joys await? We'll find out. Take care, all. Peace out.